All right, honors biology. So we just finished talking about the 6 characteristics of life, what it means to be a living thing, some real basic stuff on cells, but we're going to do a deeper dive here and talk about cells themselves and a little bit of the history behind them, and then what are the 2 major types of cells, etc. here. So for you guys, this is a continuation of the notes page, second page there, and I really just have 3 kind of larger things I need you to fill out on this that are additional for you. Okay, let's just dive right into it then. This is where we continue on, honors only. If you're in general biology and you did want to tackle this, go for it, extra credit. So, cell theory, an epically small journey. I titled that. I did. Okay, so I always like stories, and I always love the stories that about science and scientific discoveries and things of that nature. I just think they're fascinating. But science really, in our modern time, kicks off around 500 years ago during a time called the Scientific Revolution. And there's events in the Scientific Revolution that really kind of herald and kind of spark its initiation. But it's really what's going on behind the curtains, right? Or the mindset, the thinking that is going on that is so revolutionary in science and to science. The Scientific Revolution starts in Italy in 1543, and 2 publications sort of mark the official beginning of this revolution. They are Andreas Vesalius's On the Fabric of the Human Body. It has a longer Latin title to it, and I've put a link here to it. You guys can check out a little bit about this person. But he was the first person to really delve into deeply human anatomy, and he's the first person to describe all of the major body systems that we're made of: the skeletal system, the muscular system, the nervous system, the circulatory system. And he did all of these amazing drawings of dissections and human anatomy. It's a pretty gnarly, gross job if you think about it. He's an amazing artist and very detailed, and dedicated his entire life to this pursuit and to his work. It really changed our understanding of what we are, what animals are, what life is, and broke it down and took the magic really out of it. Because before that, it was all magical thinking, and medicine was a lot of just quack magic approaches that were not successful and didn't work. So this really led to where we're at today, right, with our modern medical treatments that we have. And then the other publication that came out was Copernicus's On the Revolution of Heavenly Spheres, again named in Latin, but here's a copy of the cover of this, and really describing how the Earth is not the center of the universe, and how we rotate around the sun, and there are stars and there are planets, and really based solely on observation, right? Solely on observation. More to the point, though, the Scientific Revolution comes at a time when there were many sort of revolutions of humanity. Right, there's the Renaissance, right? There's the revolution in art and culture, really. And this started because we started digging ourselves out of what was called the Dark Ages, and societies began to coalesce and trade ideas. Societies got bigger, cities got bigger, and ideas began to grow again. We dug up the old writings of the Greeks and the Arabs from the Middle East, the philosophers and the scholars from there. A lot of their works had been outlawed, had been banned, had been burned, and they were traded like underground, like on the dark web or something. And now people started to collect these things and started to look again at where we were before all of these religious wars exploded for over 1,000 years throughout, Europe and Asia and the Middle East. And so that, along with advancements in technology, allowed us to make microscopes and other telescopes and other things, and continue the work of the Greeks and stuff from over 1,000 years before, which is pretty interesting. So the Scientific Revolution takes off. And through Copernicus's work with telescopes and stuff, the first real biologist, I guess you could say, in a sense, might have been this guy Leeuwenhoek, who invents a microscope in the 1600s, and he was the first to see tiny organisms in drops of water. This really changed our idea of life. Before that, the Greeks had come up with the two main divisions of life. Socrates had plants and animals, and these were the two groups. This is a very land-centric view of the world as well, plants and animals. Plants are on land, right? In water, you have algae and planktons and all these other things. Well, we didn't really pay attention too much to what was going on in water, other than maybe fish. But Leeuwenhoek takes some pond water and looks at it under his microscope and sees this whole new world, all these new life forms, right there in front of our eyes for a long, long time. This is why we have water filters and boil water too. Okay, so he looks down and sees these crazy little things, and there's so many different cool forms. And please take marine biology, because we'll look at plankton under microscopes for several days in that class. It's a lot of fun. Okay, early cell research. Robert Hooke in 1665 is the first person to officially give cells their names. I think the story behind this is kind of funny. All the paintings I find of Hooke, he's an interesting looking fella over there. And if you look at plant cells, they are very organized and structured here on the left. And they reminded him of prison cells. This is a picture of a medieval prison cell system, right? They had the bars and the gates were all crossed over like that. And scientists back in this time happened to spend a lot of time locked up in prison, right? The truth hurt. Okay. Other early research and notable contributions to modern biology. These people here determined that all plants are made of cells, and then a year later, this other person determined that all animals are made of cells, right? And then a few years later, Rudolph here determined that all cells arise from pre-existing cells. This was a huge one, actually, because people didn't know where life came from. And there was this idea of spontaneous generation, that you could sprinkle some magic dust or that lightning might strike and that some type of weird life form might arise from the mud. But life has to come from a cell. Now, the question then, of course, harkens back to what would the first cell be then and how did that arise? And there's research into that. But that's a separate topic than what we're talking about here. And that's even separate from evolution itself. Because once you have one cell and it can divide, and then the whole process begins. But the fact that all plants and animals were made of cells, every single one, really showed us that we're all linked and related and tied together, and that we are more alike than we are different. We'll get into that more here in just a second. So there's three principles to what we now in modern times call cell theory. And cell theory has these three tenets: that all living things are made of cells. Here on Earth, we know that that's true. That cells are the basic unit of structure and function in all living things, right? So cells make up all living things, and cells also control what living things do, and the different parts of living things as well have different jobs in complex things. And new cells are produced from existing cells. Okay, so this is the basic idea of cells here on Earth. Now let's jump into cell parts. Okay, sorry, I packed a lot of information into this slide here, but let's just get it all in there. So all cells on Earth have four basic structural things that they share in common with each other. And then, of course, they vary, right? Because life is varied here on Earth. From that, they all have these four basic things. All cells have a cell membrane, a thin flexible barrier around the cell, and I should have put it on in here because it's on Earth. The structure of that cell membrane is the same for everything, living thing here on Earth. It's what we call a phospholipid bimembrane. And it's a unique and cool structure. It's like two sleeping bags kind of with the feet touching in the middle. And we'll just go here, phospholipid bilayer. There we go. Show you a picture of it real quick. Boom. And boom. So it's got these little heads and then these little tiny feet that stick down that are made of fats. And it's got heads on the outside and the feet touch in the middle. And that surrounds all cells here on Earth. All cells have a cell membrane, and all the cell membranes are the same, actually, made of the same basic material, which is pretty cool. All cells have a cytoplasm. There's a material, a juicy juice that's found inside, kind of like your blood. And yeah, all cells have that. It's not that fascinating. But all cells have DNA or RNA is fascinating. It's the genetic information used to make more cells. And I talked about this in the last video on what is life, so I'm not going to go too much more into it here. We'll get into it later. But that right there is super important and super fascinating, and also shows that we're all related. All cells have proteins or ribosomes, and these are biological molecules that DNA codes for, and they do the work of biology, right? They don't just make up structural things. I mean, they do, but they also do all of the mechanical parts. They carry things around. They transport. They are biological signals. There's parts of the cell membrane actually are proteins as well. You have the fat layer. Here, the phospholipid layer, but then this big chunky purple thing you see here is a protein that lets certain things in and out. So it acts as a sort of a gatekeeper for cell interaction with their environment. So all cells have all four of these things. They have a cell membrane. They have squishy, squishy, juicy, juicy on the inside, cytoplasm. They have the DNA or RNA, the code information. And they have proteins that do the jobs that the DNA tells them to do. Now, some cells have a cell wall. Plants have cell walls. Plants don't have skeletons or other things like that, or exoskeletons. They have a cell wall. So it's a strong structural layer outside the cell membrane, outside that phospholipid layer, and it's found in plants. All plants have a cell wall of some type, and it's what allows them to gain structure and build up. And then as the cell dies, that cell wall will remain, as you see here in this microscopic image, and that is what makes up cellulose. I'm knocking on it right here. This table also makes up paper and even clothing, is that cell wall left over from the plant. Fungi have a cell wall as well, actually, which is interesting. They have it made out of a material called chitin, which is actually the same type of material that insects make their exoskeleton out of. Fungi are more related to animals than they are to plants, actually. And then bacteria many bacteria have cell walls as well. Animals do not animals. Animals don't have cell walls. Some cells have a nucleus. It's a large structure, and it contains all the genetic information. We're going to get into this in just a second, but in tiny single-celled things like bacteria, they don't have a lot of DNA because they're pretty simple. I mean, it's still a lot, but it's not a lot. And so they don't have a nucleus. But a nucleus in larger things or more complicated things, because there's so much more DNA, needs to kind of stay organized, and it needs to stay protected from getting damaged. And so a nucleus surrounds and protects it. And the nucleus is made up of the same stuff as the cell membrane. It's phospholipid layer, but it's actually two double layers of that. So they just double down on that structure. Here's a scanning electron microscope image of a nucleus, and part of it is broken off here. So that's some of the DNA on the inside, and these little white circle things you see here are actually the nuclear pores, where material can move in and out of the nucleus to create more DNA. You can take in tiny nucleic acid bases there. And nucleus is about 30% of eukaryotic cells by volume, so it's a pretty large nugget in the middle here. And in a plant cell, you can really see the nucleus is here. This is kind of cool. This is an animal cell, so not as organized like prison cells. And this is a cool image using, they're staining proteins in this one. And then they stain them, and then they fluoresce them, and they shine different lights on them under microscopes and take images. This is the nucleus, and these are all of the little proteins that go around inside a cell and actually give a cell structure. They're called the cytoskeleton of a cell. They're like little wire girders that support the cell and move things around. Some cells have organelles, little organs inside the cell. Right? So you're an organism made of organs, right? And cells have organelles, little tiny things. Some cells have them that do different jobs, and there's a whole host of these. You learn these in middle school when you make a cake or something like that, and then you forget them a day later. I'm not going to make us memorize them all, but here's a little table with a list of all of the common organelles that you find in cells. And plants and animals share almost all of their organelles, and then plants have a few that are different, and animals have a couple that are different as well. But again, we're more alike than we are separate when you look at us biologically. So here's some of those organelles. Okay, last little bit here. This is really the fun stuff as far as I'm concerned. Or interesting. There are two types of organisms based on cell type. So now that we know that all living things are made of cells, right? We know that cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things, and we know that in order to make more cells, you need to have one cell in the first place. Cells arise from pre-existing cells, the baton of life. There are two basic cell types that we could look at. Again, cells have four things in common. That's cell membrane, DNA, a cytoplasm, and proteins or ribosomes, as you can see in here. But there are two kind of categories of cells that you can break them into based on other characteristics that they have that are separate. The first group of cells, and the oldest one, and the smallest, and the simplest, are the prokaryotes. These are organisms with cells that do not have a nucleus. There's no nucleus in a prokaryote. Instead, their DNA just kind of sits in there like a big thing of spaghetti. They call it a nucleoid. They are small. They are single-celled or unicellular organisms, single-celled organisms. And they include the groups bacteria and archaea. Archaea, very similar to bacteria. You would probably not be able to tell by looking at them, but then you would do some genetic and chemical work on them and see that they have their own distinct features. Archaea are the oldest living things on Earth. They predate bacteria, and then bacteria evolved and arose from archaea. And archaea are still around today. They live in extreme environments and places. They're single-celled. You can see them with the naked eye, though. You can see colonies of them. So this is a bacterial stain that was done in a petri dish and some agar probably. And then as they grow, you can start to see them. And the analogy here is that if you're looking from an airplane, you can see the beach down below out the window, but you can't see the grains of sand. You can't see the individual bacteria with your eye here, but you can still see the product of the bacteria. Right, the mass of them, the population, just like a beach is a population of sand. So in order to see the individual bacteria, you would need to get a microscope and look really closely. Just like in order to see the grains of sand here, you would need to jump out of that airplane and then get onto your hands and knees and look down at the sand on the beach. Just because you can't see it with your eye doesn't mean it's not there. Here's some other images of prokaryotes. This one here is an actual microscopic image. This is a transmitting electron microscope image here. And in this one here, you can actually see the nucleoid, right? That DNA squiggly spaghetti just floating in the middle there of this bacteria. And so this is sliced in half, and then this is a model of it, a diagram of it. And bacteria have different shapes, right? They're not all that long capsule shaped. Some of them are tiny and round. And then some of them are actually squiggly as well, and curlicues are three different forms that bacteria take on, or archaea. Okay, the next group of organisms based on cell type, prokaryotes, they're single-celled, they're tiny, they don't have a nucleus, is the eukaryotes. Eukaryotes. So karyote refers to a kernel or a seed, and we're talking about a nucleus, and eu means new. This is the new seed. Pro means before. So a prokaryote means before there was a nucleus. These are organisms that existed before things were super complex, and they did not have a nucleus. A eukaryote means new seed, new nucleus, and we can see it in the middle. So organisms that contain a nucleus, and they also have specialized organelles. Most are large multicellular organisms. When it comes to the eukaryotes, there's four different groups that we're going to talk about in a second, but plants, animals, and fungus are three of them. Three of the four. So these are large multicellular things. And they include, okay, duh, I just said it, plants, animals, and fungus. And also a group called protists. Those are single-celled or multi-celled. Protist is a weird dumping group. Here's an example of a protist here, a rotifer. They make up slime molds as well, and they also make up algae. That's kind of cool. Algae are not plants. They are in a different group. And, yeah, oh, I have it right there as well, right? So again, if we want to jump down and see the size of some of these things here when it comes to eukaryotes versus prokaryotes, we'll go back to this, which I showed in the first video, and we'll zoom in to a single-celled organism, an amoeba. This is a protist. This is the largest of the eukaryotic cells. Then we've got a paramecium, another eukaryotic cell. We've got a human egg, another eukaryotic cell. A skin cell, a smaller eukaryotic cell. So they range in size quite a bit, eukaryotic cells do. The smallest eukaryotic cells are going to be things like red blood cells, which actually lack a nucleus. And it's an exception. They could, but they've kicked it out, so that's why. And then if you want to get to a prokaryote, you can almost see one here. It's this little white dot right here. There's your bacteria. Let's zoom out again. So there's your prokaryote here, this E. coli bacteria. Mitochondria, their ancestors were bacteria, were prokaryotes, and they're a symbiotic adaptation that live inside of our bodies now. We're the host. Endosymbiosis. And then we're going to jump out and start looking at eukaryotes. So big eukaryotes, nucleus, organelles, and then tiny, tiny prokaryotes right there. Let's look at some more eukaryotes real quick. Well, let's not. Let's look at the history of things here. So prokaryotes existed for the first 3.8 billion years here on Earth. Oh, they formed 3.8 billion years ago. Yes. And they were the first living things here on Earth. They go back really far. This is the tree of life done by genetic analysis of living things and grouping them based on genetic similarities. This was finally completed in 2008 because genetic sciences are new, and this is really cool. So it's mapping prokaryote, eukaryote, and all the other groups in here. So prokaryotes down in here, no nucleus, tiny, and the oldest fossils go back about 3.8 billion years in these stromatolite masses that show up in places like Australia and I believe in Wales, in British Isles as well. And then eukaryotes show up about 2.7 billion years ago. So you had over 1 billion years of just prokaryotes in the waters. Okay, that's a long time, a billion years. In the last billion years, we've seen animals, and we've seen the three different, major periods of life. So a billion years is a long time. And then eukaryotes show up about 2.7 billion years ago, larger with a nucleus and organelles, and most likely the result of prokaryotes going inside other prokaryotes, and then you start to get these symbiotic relationships more and more complex. We still have prokaryotes in us as our mitochondria, basically. So we can look at life breaking into these different groups then. The prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. Prokaryotes in the bottom, the oldest, and the eukaryotes here on the top. Are you following me? And then these are the 6 different kingdoms of life. Bacteria and archaea make up the prokaryotic kingdoms based on cell type. And then you cross that line and you get into the eukaryotic groups. And the big ones are plants, animals, and fungus. These are the multicelled ones. But they stem and originate from a group called the protistas. The protistas are often, we mentioned them before, single-celled eukaryotes. And protistas are a dumping ground, and they're fascinating to look into. In another slide or so, I've included a link that you could take a deeper dive into them if you want to. It is this group, protistas are the ones that showed up, 2.7 billion years ago and make up algae and planktons and all kinds of things in the oceans and amoebas and rotifers, and it goes on and on. From them evolved plants. From them evolved fungus. From them evolved animals. And protistas have members of them that have traits that are very similar to all of these groups. So that's why it shows it here in the middle and then everything branching out from it. It is the primordial soup from which all other groups of eukaryotes evolved. And different types of protists have different traits that show those groups. So this graphic here shows it very well, I think, as well. So prokaryotes, I broke it down, always single-celled, no nucleus, bacteria, and archaea. People will screw this up and they'll say eukaryotes are always multicelled. No, they are single and multicelled. But if you're multicelled, you are a eukaryote. But if you're single-celled, you could be either, right? It's the presence of a nucleus or not. Because eukaryotes have a nucleus and organelles, and they include protists, fungus, animals, and plants. Over here, these 4 kingdoms of life. I've broken that down here in a little box where I just said the 6 kingdoms of life listed above are broken into the 2 larger groups or divisions, prokaryote and eukaryote, right? And in life, we classify things, right? We classify things based on characteristics that they have, and then we put them into groups. Okay, so classification-wise, we start with division, prokaryote or eukaryote, and then we go to kingdoms. What are the different kingdoms? Which kingdom are you in? And then from that, if you're in the animal kingdom, we'll break you further down, like I have behind me here in all these jars, all the different phylums of animals. And then from phylums, we go to class, and then from class, we go to order, and then we go family, and then finally genus and species to the individual living thing. All living things we can break and name. We've identified 7 million living things, and we've only named 1 million at this point, because naming them and classifying them takes time and is hard work. And there's a lot of cool research out there. So as humans, let's talk about our own classification. Where are we? We are eukaryote. We're an animal. We're in the animal kingdom. We're in the phylum Vertebrata, along with all the other things with backbones, because we have that. We're a mammal, right? Warm-blooded. We have hair. We produce milk. We have all the traits of a mammal. We're a mammal. And then, what type of mammal are we? Well, we're a primate. We belong to the group Primata. And then below that, we are in the family. Oh, I forgot to put it up there. We are in the family Hominidae. We're in our own family, Hominidae, but we're actually in that family with all the other great apes. That includes orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans. We are all in that family Hominidae. There are other primates, but they're in other families. So we are not a monkey. We are an ape. And then we're in the genus Homo, and then species Sapien. Kind of cool how it all links together. And then back to protists. I just wanted to mention they're a dumping ground. Here's all the different types of protists and different groups of them. Pretty crazy, cool stuff. And I put a link here. You can investigate them more because they're the oddballs in life, and I find them fascinating. In marine biology, we spend a lot of time looking at protists, at phytoplankton, and we use microscopes to look at stuff that I go out and get right here in our local bays and estuaries. It's kind of fun. All right. So use all that information that I just spit there, another 26-minute video, go Sephora, to answer these 3 basic questions. All right. Thank you, guys. Sephora out.